Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. The American left historically, unfortunately, has often been masterfully self-destructive. They've allowed various parochial issues, factions, and schisms to dominate their message. These messengers have often insisted that all those on the left should follow their particular version of a leftist truth. Theirs was the purest vision of that truth. In reality, they've turned off large segments of the populace to the cause. They've cannibalized, divided, and helped destroy burgeoning and flourishing popular progressive movements. Today, under the Trump administration, America is facing one of the most direct and critical challenges in its history to the idea and institutions of its own existence as a democracy. The American left is going through another period reminiscent of the 60s and 70s, when cleavages within progressive forces widened, weakening the movement and leaving American society more vulnerable to right-wing counter-movements and neo-fascist authoritarian governing. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination is one of the leading voices in the country who can help us understand these struggles. He's a historian, Professor Michael Fischbach, who recently has written two major, critically acclaimed books, profoundly timely assessments of the movement and these times. In his 2018 book, Black Power and Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color, he traces the hidden history of the Arab-Israeli conflict's role in African-American activism and the ways that distant struggle shaped the domestic fight for racial equality in America. Black Power's transnational connections between African-Americans and Palestinians deeply affected U.S. Black Power advocates and left-wing white radicals in America during that period. In his 2020 book, The Movement and the Middle East, How the Arab-Israeli Conflict Divided the American Left, he offers the first assessment of the controversial and ultimately debilitating role the Arab-Israeli conflict has played and is playing among left-wing activists. That conflict continues to have a lasting impact that still powerfully affects progressive American politics today. Debates on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, one state, two state solutions, Zionism as racism argument, Canary Project, Campus Watch, academic freedom and free speech issues on campus, a 2017 resolution on the need for truth, seeking, democracy, and freedom of thought and expression on campus, the Women's 2018 March, roiled by accusations of anti-Semitism, sharp spikes in levels of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim incidents and sentiments in recent years in the country. The examples are many, and the list goes on. Who has the purest position? Which candidate and agenda must be followed to gain their support and favor, if any? As Michael puts it, like American politics, Middle Eastern politics are in turmoil, and they present progressive Americans with the same kinds of challenges they did in the 1960s. It's a painful process as we move in a more progressive direction. The hope is we come out of it in a better place in the end, a more moral and even-handed place. Michael Fischbach is professor of history at Randolph-Macon College, has been awarded grants by the MacArthur Foundation, the United States Institute of Peace. He has presented in numerous academic and diplomatic settings in 16 countries on 4 continents. I was blessed and fortunate to meet him recently at a guest lecture he gave on his work at a Center for Palestine Studies sponsored Columbia University event. And I'm thrilled to have him here on the show to continue an important discussion, one that's important for the campaign season, for the integrity of the American left, and for the future of democracy here and around the world. So welcome, Michael, to the Radical Imagination. You're Skyping in from Virginia. We wish you were here in the studio, but it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here and with your viewers.
Thank you again. Well, listen, we're taping this show a day after the New Hampshire primary, won by Bernie Sanders. Talk about Bernie's movement, all kinds of talk about movements, counter movements, so on. How does this relate to your work? Give our audience a sense of what a movement means, what it is, and what you're referring to when you talk about some of the struggles in the 60s and 70s within these various movements.
Well, back in the 60s, many people used the term movement. And on one level, they all meant the same thing, but at times it varied a little. Certainly during the civil rights movement, Black activists spoke about the movement, meaning the movement to achieve racial freedom, and particularly in the South, desegregation and voting rights. Activists, Black and white, against the war in Vietnam frequently used the term the movement, capital T, right, capital M. And I think in general, if you fold all those together, when activists seeking broad systemic change within the United States, and certainly its foreign policy, referred to a variety of these groups and efforts collectively as the movement, meaning the movement to make America a fairer, a better place, more equal, and with a more peaceful foreign policy. So when people spoke of the movement, they may have referred to themselves in the specific anti-war context or the racial freedom struggle, but by and large, it was all part of a largely, but not exclusively, youth-led effort to make the United States a better and more equal place for all of its citizens.
A transformative United States, structurally, morally, economically, politically. Now, there's variations within those struggles, but how does it relate to some of the efforts today by, let's start with some of the Democratic politicians?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and he himself is a veteran of various movements back in the 60s.
Right.
And in some ways, he's emblematic of some of the things I discuss in my various works about the 60s, and how particularly the Arab-Israeli conflict affected the American left and even broader liberal society at the time. Sanders, in many ways, is emblematic of that. Yeah, he comes from a socialist background. There were several democratic socialist organizations. In fact, there was a famous split in 1972. And by and large, there was a tremendous amount of disagreement among socialists at the time about how to approach the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the fact that many people on the American left were Jewish, that Jews were disproportionately well represented on all stratas, from the Marxist left to the social democratic left, keep moving rightwards into just liberals. There was a high Jewish presence, and many of them were quite willing to criticize Israeli actions as being consistent with what they saw as a wider American-dominated imperialist movement. And there were others on the left, Jews and non-Jews, who saw Israel, by contrast, as a socialist paragon of virtue that somehow was exempt from the same kind of anti-imperialist critiques that others on the left viewed Israel. Sanders seems to have come out of the former. He's lived in Israel a number of years ago, but he is the major voice in the Democratic Party among, well, he's not even a Democrat, but running for president, shall we say, in being willing to critique Israel as part of his wider agenda, his wider worldview that seeks to promote justice and a more humane American foreign policy. So in some ways, the backlash against him that is going on as we speak by groups within the Democratic Party, such as a group that was established in 2018 called the Democratic Majority for Israel. They've already been airing attack ads. And as I argued in my book, this is going to create a problem for the Democratic Party. It's much more liberal, progressive, typically not Bernie Sanders, but typically younger left flank, like really the left globally and in the United States, are all pretty solidly behind the Palestinian struggle. It's the older, more established, certainly the party bosses that are attuned with the funders, are in bed with Wall Street, that are aghast at this phenomenon. So as the left found itself really fractured over the question of how do we deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict 5 decades ago, I think the Democratic Party today, which is, I would not call left wing, but let's say progressives in America, are facing that same problem. How are we going to somehow be united to deal with an election against Trump in 2020 when we have this major difference among us about just how far our progressive values are willing to go? Do they include Israel and the Palestinians, or do they not?
And how is this all tied in with the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s and the struggles today? Bernie, of course, has some prominent representatives, Cornel West, Nina Turner as campaign manager, who are strong voices for civil rights as well as for Palestinian rights. Mm-hmm. So, again, a little history for our audience here. How does the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement in particular, as you write, enter into this struggle?
Well, certainly, in the crudest level, you could speak of two wings of the Black freedom struggle by the mid-late 60s. The civil rights wing, which sought the end of segregation in the South, generally, integration into American society. And then you had, really to its left, the Black Power movement, which was seeking different things. And there were a variety of aspects of that, from the Black Panther Party to other groups. But by and large, that divide also expressed itself in terms of how these groups approached the Arab-Israeli conflict. Traditional civil rights groups like the NAACP and CORE generally were much more, in fact, fairly stridently pro-Israeli. Bayard Rustin being a great example. He was once called Israel's man in Harlem.
Right.
Advocating vociferously for American support for Israel, which in many ways was consistent with the civil rights struggle's overall attitude of trying to become part of the American mainstream, not overthrow it or revolutionize it.
Assimilate and integrate.
And and the Black Power people, particularly people like Malcolm X, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, later the Black Panthers, saw their role as really trying to revolutionize both America and the world. And for them, the paradigm of Israel as an essentially European created entity in the midst of the Arab world, dispossessing a kindred people of color, the Palestinians, came very easily to the racialized worldview of Black Power advocates. In some ways, it was easy for them to identify with the Palestinians as they saw it, as a kindred people of color. And that division between the traditional civil rights leaders, the Black Power movement, was quite divisive because it intersected with some other problems going on in the 60s, Black-Jewish friction and things like this. But certainly it's fair to say that the kind of Black activists you see today that support the Palestinians, the Black Lives Matter movement, various hip hop artists, it's much more mainstream now today that for Black Americans to have a visceral identity with Palestinians, not all, but certainly that expressions of that we see in, for instance, Black Lives Matter has a long history that goes back to the 60s. When, as I said, it came naturally to them to see themselves in a racialized imperialist global system as being on the same side as the Palestinians. So that pressure within the Democratic Party, within others who support, let's call it the left wing of the Democratic Party, who are Black, who are willing to criticize Israel, has, like I said, a pretty long history going back several decades.
A couple of points. King himself, in a sense, you've written, right? He wanted it both ways, in a sense, both sides. Is that an accurate depiction of his attempts to resolve the Arab-Israeli Israeli conflict? In other words, he didn't agree with, as you say, Malcolm X and the Black Power advocates. So, what was his role in this?
Well, King, like Malcolm X, had actually been to Arab Palestine. He visited the West Bank in March of 1959, actually fell ill there and was treated by a local doctor who, while an ethnic Armenian, filled in King, at King's request, by the way, filled him in on the history of what happened to the Palestinians during the creation of Israel in 1948. So King was well aware of Palestinian grievances and suffering. But he was also, working within the mainstream. He had many prominent Jewish supporters and non-Jews, for that matter. But he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And so when Israel launched the 1967 war, it really put him in a quandary because he was planning for a big peace march in August of 67, 2 months after the war. He was also planning in November of 67 for a huge international pilgrimage to particularly Jerusalem, which was now under Israeli military occupation. So he was really in a quandary as how do I, as a global peacemaker who've just come out against the war in Vietnam, have the Nobel Peace Prize, how do I deal with the fact that Israel, an American ally, has launched an attack, has occupied a massive amount of Arab territory, including the holy shrines where I intend to visit. Right. How can I still go there and not appear to legitimize it?
So he
privately,
he didn't go, right?
He ended up not going.
He never went, right? Exactly.
Not go.
Right.
And he confided to his aides that this was a real problem. He was balancing between maintaining his liberal support, including Jewish support, versus dealing with critiques from the Black Power movement. He was still dealing with the impact of having abandoned President Johnson on the war in Vietnam and what was that going to mean. And then he was being pressured by major Jewish organizations to make a statement about Israel because of Black Power attacks on Israel. Exactly. And they wanted to know where King stood on all this. So he, in the end, in September of 67, issued a statement in the name of his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, essentially saying, well, Israel exists, that must be, everyone must acknowledge and respect that. But on the other hand, and of course he had just witnessed a whole summer of fairly violent Black uprisings in the inner cities, he said, well, but the Arab anger is not, we have to deal with. And he proposed essentially dealing with it economically. He never came out and acknowledged the political dimension of Palestinian grievances, but he did try to remain even-handed by saying, well, we're going to have to deal with issues of poverty and what's driving the Arab world to be so angry, but at the same time, the Arabs have to recognize Israel. And he tried to be quite careful in how he worded that, but he did concede to his young aide, Jesse Jackson, who later wrote about this in an autobiography. He did concede to Jackson that this was going to be the next big issue, as he called it, the Palestinian issue. And he knew he was going to have to deal with it in the future, but unfortunately, he was dead within a year after the 67 war.
But he never equated Zionism as racism, for example.
Oh, no, quite the opposite. He is alleged to have said that anti-Zionism was a kind of anti-Semitism, but there have been various efforts to try to find that actual speech, that actual.
There's controversy.
It has been proven that there are actual forgeries out there, that there are letters he supposedly wrote, one called A Letter to an Anti-Zionist Friend, that are forgeries. I mean, people are still trying to figure out how it ended up being cited and where it came from, but even pro-Israeli groups have admitted that some of these sentiments that anti-Zionism is really a form of anti-Semitism that allegedly came out of King's mouth, in fact, never did.
Well, exactly. King never directly addressed issues of how to bring about peace, did he, in the region? And he never related to or directly acknowledged what the Black Power advocates might say, that Israel was a colonial creation in a sense. In other words, would you say it's fair to say that he thought of it, as you write in one of your chapters, as an example of exceptionalism, Israeli exceptionalism? And if you could explain a little bit more about what that means.
When I used the term Israel exceptionalism, what I meant is that there were various forces, notably on the white left, whether the old left, the new left, even the anti-war movement, even among liberals, I wouldn't call them left, Israel exceptionalism. by which their overall anti-imperialist analysis of the world stopped at the frontiers of Israel. That is to say, there were American leftists who were quite willing to speak of American imperialism, of colonialism, of white domination in places like South Africa and what was then called Rhodesia, that supported liberation struggles in the third world, but did not and would not understand Israel in that anti-imperialist context. That's what I referred to as Israel exceptionalism. This was the great exception to the anti-imperialist rule. And people, for instance, in SDS, Students for Democratic Society, noted leader at Columbia, Mark Rudd, told me decades later, after the 60s, said that this was the real dividing line between what he called the anti-imperialist left and the more liberal left. And that was, where do you stand on Israel? And so it became a real point of contention. And there were certainly Jewish leftists and liberals on both sides of that. Some of the most strident voices supporting Palestinian liberation, denouncing Israel as an imperialist creation that had usurped the national rights of the Palestinian people, were Jewish. And some of the most staunch supporters of Israel, even though they may have agreed with everything else about the war in Vietnam, about the Black freedom struggle, they may have agreed with their colleagues on everything else, but viewed Israel as an exception. No, this is not an imperialist country. It is not a colonial country.
It should be equated to South Africa apartheid arrangements.
Right. I mean, there was
well.
actually a rally in New York City in late June, about 2 weeks after the June War ended in the Middle East. They were mostly liberals, not radicals, but it was an actual rally called Israel and Vietnam, There Is a Difference. And leftist writers like Michael Waltzman, Martin Peretz, they wrote an article a month after the June War in Ramparts, one of the leading left-wing magazines read
Michael
by many in the
Walzer.
New Left.
Is that
saying,
Walzer? Michael Walzer.
Yes, Michael Walzer and
Right.
Martin Peretz saying that, you know, Israel is not like Vietnam. This is not the same.
Irving Howe of Dissent, right?
Yes.
Irving Howe as well would be included in that, yeah. So,
making this same case that no, U.S. military involvement in Vietnam is not the same thing as U.S.-backed Israeli actions in the Middle East. There's a big difference. And, you know, that's what really that one book I wrote is about how these deep and quite vicious splits occurred within the white left that often pitted Jewish activists against Jewish activists.
And tell our audience, how does this all matter for the larger political scene? Because people are listening and, well, okay, this is a few hundred radicals, old left, new left, whatever. They're fighting among themselves about this particular issue. But how is it so profoundly impacting on larger political debates going on?
Well, your audience may know, as you said in your introduction, that the 1960s and 1970s left was notoriously fractious. They argued over points of tactics, they argued over strategy, they argued over just about anything. And that weakened the left. Yeah. And on top of that, these splits, which for some leftists, notably Jewish ones, were quite visceral. They got at deep issues of identity, of family. These kind of splits over Israel and the Palestinians, I argued, worsened what was already a left that was coming apart by 1969 and 1970. Certainly, there were deeper structural reasons why the left started to disintegrate, particularly the new left, but even the old left. But these only exacerbated those concerns. Another structural way it mattered was that a number of people on the left, particularly Jewish leftists, mostly from the social democratic left, not really the hard Marxist left, abandoned the left altogether in the 70s and hurtled into the arms of neoconservatism. Yes. And many of them have admitted, you know, Norman Podhoretz and others, that the left's treatment of Israel in the 60s had a lot to do with why they abandoned the left altogether and joined in with what eventually we can call the neoliberal revolution of the Reagan era. So both on an interpersonal level, contributing to an already fractious left, but even the abandonment of the left by many liberals, many in the social democratic movement, because they were were fed up with the attacks on Israel, that really helped to weaken the left. And I think that's important to remember. And I would also argue that today, 5 decades later, I submit that we're facing the same trouble in the United States. Not the true left, but if you go a little bit further to the right, let's say the Democratic Party is experiencing the exact same sorts of troubles as I mentioned earlier. And that is, what do we do about the case of Israel? Some progressives in the party and outside the Democratic Party use the term PEP, progressive except for Palestine, that they and other progressives see eye to eye on everything except the Middle East. And then their opponents, shall we say, their foes would say, but no, Israel is not in the same category as other more cut and dried, in their view, instances of social injustice. And so, in advance of what's going to be probably a pretty close election, I submit that progressives in general and the Democratic Party in particular are really going to have to grapple with its internal divisions over Israel and Palestine if it wants to promote the kind of unity I think it'll need to effectively combat Trumpism in 2020.
I agree. Michael, I have to ask you, because we've heard terms you just mentioned, the true left, the hard left, Communist Party, the old left, the new left. Please, I know we can spend hours and hours, days, talking about these different factions and sections, but help us a little bit. Help our audience and understand as best you can these factions.
Well, 5 decades ago, when people made the distinction between the old left and what came to be called the new left, what they meant is that going back to the turn of the 20th century, there have been left-wing parties and movements in the United States, from socialists to Marxists, particularly communists, to a communist split. There were Stalinists, such as the Communist Party USA. There were Trotskyists, like the Socialist Workers' Party. There were anarchists. And really, in some ways, the heyday of that was in that early period of industrial capitalism in the United States. Now, the coming of the Second World War, some of the problems in the Soviet Union, McCarthyism, really weakened the old left. But starting in the late 50s and into the 60s, a much more youthful left, what we call the new left, emerged. And in many ways, these people, white and black, were tired of old left wrangling. They believed in moral passion more than ideological purity. They didn't see themselves as rigidly anti-communist or anti-Stalinist. They just believed in changing America. They were for racial freedom. They were for ending the war in Vietnam. And so, you had, in a sense, two lefts in the 60s, remnants of the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' World Party, the Socialist Party of America. But then you had groups such as Students for a Democratic Society, or even the Yippies, that represented this new, at least initially so, less ideological left. Now, fast forward to today, when I say the true left or the real left, I still mean people whose perspective is essentially guided by some kind of, if not anti-capitalism, at least a very serious critique of capitalism, and B, a very serious critique of American social structures, and C, a very serious critique of American foreign policy. So when I say the real left, I'm not talking about liberals. I'm not talking about even many people in the Democratic Party. I'm talking about the various socialist, anarchist, Marxist groups that are not nearly as strong as they were in the 60s, but they're still around. And I'm differentiating that in today's context from the much, much broader and bigger group of people that I would call progressives or liberals, who are basically seeking change around the edges, or even a little bit more systemic change within the United States, but not nearly as radical a vision as what I'm calling the true left today. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit about the terms I've been using, both in terms of the 60s and today.
Yeah, I think that does help a lot. So again, Bernie would fit into the latter that you're referring to, or many of his followers are not so ideologically rigid, but are looking for transformative change as well.
Right. I mean, he certainly, in a sense, to call himself a socialist is a reference to the old left. I mean, there has been, and there still is a party today, although he's not a member of it. Social Democrats USA. There's also the Democratic Socialists of America, which has people like Alexandria
AOC.
Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib.
Tlaib.
Both of those are parties that extend back to a unified socialist party from 1972. So they're, in a sense, and the Workers' World Party is still around. I mean, there still are some of these old groups around. But Bernie, he's not actually a member of Democratic Socialists of America, nor of any of the other organized socialist parties. And he personally is in a sense, almost an amalgam of the old anti-capitalist critique, and yet he's operating, of course, within the American system. So both he personally and his followers are, in a sense, all over the place. I think some of them, his followers, really do see him as someone who is fundamentally challenging the essence of the American structure, both economically and politically. But I think he wouldn't see himself that way. Indeed, people on the so-called true left would say, well, you can't really run for office and really be a true leftist because you know that's not going to work. So Bernie and his followers, depends on which one of them you talk to about whether they see themselves as true leftists or just very, very liberal sort of Democrats.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Now, let's really bring this discussion up to date here too. What's been going on in campus in terms of the struggles, the Arab-Israeli conflict, making its impact on campus? Free speech, the Canary movement. Have you experienced some of that yourself, where you've been teaching? And I know you lecture all around. How have people responded to your message?
Well, largely, I haven't experienced those kinds of problems. One, I'm at a small liberal arts school in Central Virginia. And so I don't have just sometimes the constituencies, large numbers of Jewish students, of Arab students, of international students, of left-wing students, deeply, deeply right-wing students for that matter, to have this issue come up in class. Although when I teach, I have them read everybody. I have them read Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel. I have them read John Quigley's book, The Case for Palestine. They read all over the place. In my writing, I write first and foremost as an historian who, particularly these books that we're talking about today, were written as narrative histories. They have analysis, but they're essentially storytelling. And so I try to keep myself and my own points of view as mute as possible, and let the people whom I'm writing about from that time period speak for themselves. And if people have an objection to what they're saying, they can object to that person, not object to me for writing about that person. So I haven't seen that as much, but I do have friends and colleagues who have been on these lists, campus watch lists, or have people spying on them. I've known some of the more famous cases of people, and quite recently, President Trump, of course, changed by executive order the definition of Jews from a religion to an ethnic group, so that students can now ask the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos to investigate their campus if any expressions of particularly anti-Israel sentiment are interpreted by them to be a hostile environment for them as Jews. So in many ways, the Trump administration has played right into some of these much more militantly pro-Israeli groups' efforts to stifle the kinds of discussions about Arab-Israeli matters that certainly I, as an academic who believes in freedom of thought and expression, feel comfortable with. But it hasn't so much affected me personally on my campus. Things that I've written in a very, very general way on blogs have been taken by some in a completely absurd direction. And I started receiving, mail and phone calls and threats and things like that. But by and large, knock on wood, I've managed just to ply my trade as an historian. I have feelings and opinions about matters relating to Israel and Palestine and American politics, but in my writings, I try to keep those as mute as possible.
BDS, that seems to be a flashpoint issue. that Bernie hasn't supported it. He has indicated that he, if elected, might not give as much military aid to Israel. Yet he has, as I said before, people like Cornel West who are pro-BDS and who argue that America is very much of an imperialist empire. And even, of course, Cornell getting severely criticized when he talked about that within the Obama years, criticizing Obama for being the caretaker of the American empire, the plantation of the American empire. So Bernie is not going, in his rhetoric at this point, going that far. Do you think he's going to have to deal with it more seriously if he, is going to unify the party or unify his campaign?
That remains to be seen. I think thus far, his supporters who support his stand on, for instance, supporting Palestinian rights, he has publicly said he does not have a problem with conditioning continued American aid to Israel on Israel's respect for Palestinian rights. My sense thus far has been that pro-Palestinian supporters of Bernie are probably willing to let him get away with that much, saying that much, and not push him to make a full-blown stand on BDS. I think that's probably a tactical decision on their part.
Yeah.
I think in that regard, whatever he personally thinks, I think Bernie himself would be very reticent, even if he supported BDS, to come out in favor of it. But I think those who support him and supported his stance on the Middle East, I think are willing to just leave it at that he's been the most vocally pro-Palestinian figure to run for president among the Democrats, conceivably ever. Absolutely. And I think just that much is probably good enough for them. I don't think he'll cross that line. And if somebody asks him on BDS, he'll just say, no, he personally doesn't support it.
Absolutely.
He also has been vocal in saying, but I don't think supporting BDS should be criminalized, which has been happening in many state legislatures.
Right. So he supported the anti-boycott law.
Right, because here I know in the state of Virginia there were pro-Israeli figures trying to do that, and here in the South, there's a particularly ugly history of people trying to ban peaceful boycotts. This was done in the Civil Rights Movement. Blacks boycotted buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Outside the South, Governor Ronald Reagan in California in the 60s said that people who observe Cesar Chavez's great boycott, that such boycotts were, quote, immoral. And so the right has a pretty ugly history of trying to criminalize boycotts, which are, a fairly peaceful manifestation of protest, and particularly here in the South. So I think Bernie and others have been wise to say that whether or not we personally agree with BDS, to try to criminalize boycotting is an infringement on freedom of speech. And I think in that way, he's, again, tried to have it both ways. He said, I don't support BDS, but I definitely don't support criminalizing.
And again, for our audience, BDS refers to boycott, divestment, and sanctions of, I know there's people who want to use it across Israel or in the occupied territories, but it's an economic device to try to pressure Israel into a different political position, correct?
Yes, it's modeled. There were a number of Palestinian civil society organizations in 2005. And you have to understand that the much ballyhooed peace process that really kicked in 1993 was supposed to be done in 5 years, delivering essentially a Palestinian state. In the failure of that to happen, many Palestinian civil society groups issued a global call in 2005 for the rest of the world to apply the kinds of tactics used against the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was boycott, don't buy from Israeli companies, and the most controversial part of it was the cultural boycott, meaning calling on academics, for instance, not to attend conferences at Israeli universities, for singers not to do performances in Israel until essentially A, Israel, withdrew from the occupied territories and allows a Palestinian state. B, treats its own Palestinian citizens, 1 out of 5 Israelis is an Arab Palestinian, equally, and so forth. What came to be such a lightning rod is the fact that many supporters of Israel said, well, we interpret the goals of BDS to mean creating the so-called one-state solution, where Jews and Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs would all be part of one country, and which I'm not personally convinced that's at all what BDS is saying, but the argument goes that's what they're calling for, and that is tantamount to saying that there should be no Jewish state of Israel, and that is tantamount to being anti-Semitic.
I'm glad you pointed that. I think it's an important point that you just mentioned there. That we're not talking about necessarily a dissolution of any sort of Jewish presence there.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
Nobody in BDS, and I know very few Palestinians that would seriously say no Jews.
Absolutely.
Palestinian leaders that would say Jews need to leave.
And Cornell would agree with you on this. He's not for boycott of cultural and academics on campus, Israeli spokespeople on campus as well. So just want to point that out.
And BDS, the culture, the proponents of BDS have said, we're not talking about an individual interacting with, an Israeli academic, for instance. What they're talking about are sort of formal links. And there are many who disagree with that, including very strongly pro-Palestinian people who do not subscribe to a complete cutoff of academic ties and things like that. So it's been controversial even on the left, but certainly the kinds of organized pro-Israeli forces have leapt on the anti-BDS bandwagon by saying it is, whether it admits it or not, and this I'm speaking as they would, I'm not saying this is what I personally believe.
Right.
They said this is designed to end the Zionism, to end the idea that Jews have a right to a sovereign state of their own in Palestine.
Right. That's not going to get anywhere. But I think what's so helpful is Bernie making statements, analogy between his own family's experience during the Holocaust and losing members of his own family, Holocaust, and what is happening to Palestinians under the Israeli occupation. And he, as a Jew, I think is offering a very, very important voice there to the narrative that's so desperately needed. I think we need on both sides that sort of rhetoric to break the logjam of cycles of continual violence.
Well, certainly he has, as a Jewish person, he certainly has the moral authority, shall we say, or the background, the ability to make those kind of pronouncements about Israel and the Palestinians that I dare say others of his stature running for president would never do. Now, there are, to be sure, younger people in the Democratic Party. And I mentioned, the so-called the squad, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, especially so Rashida Tlaib, who are speaking out very much so in favor of Palestinian rights. But I think no question the fact that Bernie himself, he's lived in Israel, his own background as a Jewish person, as a socialist, gives him some credence that others, even if they believe the same thing as he, would be much more reticent to come out in public. And frankly, that's one reason why there's such fear within the Democratic Party. It's not simply that he's a self-described democratic socialist. It's that he's upsetting a lot of apple carts within the party. I saw just on today, Goldman Sachs was telling somebody that, he's just as divisive as Trump. Well, hello, of course, Goldman Sachs. Bernie speaks against corporate billionaires. Of course, Goldman Sachs is going to view that negatively. So the people who bankroll the Democratic Party, the people who are in bed with Wall Street, the party bosses, the Pelosi's, the Schumers, and even other people who aren't even bosses, Cory Booker. I mean, these people, they're not comfortable with him challenging the traditional party's understanding, which is that Israel are the good guys and this is how it's going to be. So the fact that Bernie is not only doing that, but is himself Jewish, I think is really rattling a lot of cages.
That's a great, great point. I think it's a very important point to bring out. We spent a lot of time on talking about your books. Here's one I brought on to the set, The Movement in the Middle East. Terrific, terrific book, really well done. And as you say, you've got a lot of first-person narratives there and so on. You've written a couple of other books. You've done a lot of work on land issues and restitution on both sides. Do you want to spend a few minutes on that work, that body of work in your repertoire?
Sure, yeah. I cut my teeth really as an historian of the modern Middle East, dealing with issues about land ownership. My dissertation dealt with land ownership in Jordan, but I've always had an interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it was my second book, but my first major book that came out that gained some public notice was dealing with the question of Palestinian refugee property. 1 out of 2 Palestinian Arabs was displaced, either kicked out or fled as a refugee during the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948. 1 out of 2, and of the area that became Israel, it was 4 out of 5 were gone, and they left behind a vast amount of land and real estate and homes and cars and farm animals and furniture and what have you. And so I wrote a book based in part on UN records that were done to calculate what the value of all this property would be if there was ever some kind of compensation package at the end of the day that would be part of a peace process. Well, there's never been a peace, and there's never been any kind of compensation.
Right.
I also, in the process of writing that, found that Israel had made counterclaims, saying, well, we absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jews who left, sometimes under duress, Arab countries, and notably places like Iraq, and they left behind homes and property. And Israel announced in 1951 that it would deduct the amount from what was owed to the Palestinian refugees, deduct the value from what Jews had left behind in Arab countries. Now, Palestinians said, well, what do we and our suffering have to do with what happened in Iraq? But putting that aside, that prompted me to write on that subject, because most of what is out there was fairly polemical. And I said, well, let me look at the records. Good historian, let me find records. And I went all over Israel, Britain, the United States, to look at that question of Jewish property losses in the Arab world. So land and property issues, compensation related to refugees and migrants back and forth across the borders of the Arab-Israeli conflict was what occupied much of my scholarly writing in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. And it was only recently that I kind of married my professional interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict with some of my personal interests and teaching interests in America in the 1960s, and kind of put those two together and said, wow, there was this whole history of how the Arab-Israeli conflict affected America in the 60s that I'd never heard of, frankly. And it stunned me. I didn't know Malcolm X went to Palestine. I didn't know the Black Panthers supported Israel. I didn't know the left suffered from these splits. And so, I've kind of, the Arab-Israeli conflict has remained a constant, but my academic research journey has shifted from land and property and refugees into really American history. And it's been quite a ride and a lot of fun along the way, I must admit.
Well, as an academic and as a deeply concerned human being about the issue, I really commend you. These books are so helpful. They're unique. They're new. They really add to the narrative in ways that are so very, very important. We only just have a minute or two left. What are you working on now? Or let's put it this way. Are you hopeful that the left can get this together and be unified enough to fight against the neo-fascist and fascist encroachments that we're facing here under the Trump administration? Are we finally going to do it this time?
Yes and no. And let me explain in 30 seconds what I mean.
Okay.
I might personally argue that this is unfortunate, but the reality is that the Democratic Party, the liberals, progressives, the actual left in America has generally always operated under the assumption that at the end of the day, even those who strongly support the Palestinians are still going to vote for the Democratic candidate, no matter what. And I think Democratic Party has generally counted on that support and frankly has often ignored pressures from within its own ranks to be more supportive of Palestinian rights. So I think, are they going to come together? They'll come together for the sake of defeating Trump, just like they came together to defeat George Bush II, going back to Reagan, going back to Nixon. In the end, they'll close ranks, but it won't mean that they've come to an accord on this issue.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Michael. Again, Movement in the Middle East, your most recent book. It's absolutely terrific. We're going to close with Bob Marley, One Love. Thank you so very, very much, Michael, for being on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week.
This holy Armageddon. One love.